It's a pleasure to be here, and I've learned a great deal from the presentations that I've heard. I'll dive right into it. I'm talking about the problem of evil, and I think the natural place to start, and I'll have something to say about the book of Job, but I think it's important to start out thinking about Genesis. In Genesis, as we've already discussed, Christians find the story of the fall. This is not a story that has much prominence in Jewish sources. The idea of original sin, the idea of inherited sin, the idea of vicarious atonement, all of these ideas are somewhat foreign to Judaism. Personally, I take a kind of Maimonidean reading of that story, which is understood to be an allegory of the human condition. What is it about human beings that differentiates us? We start out with reason, and we have a tendency to betray our reason. Maimonides explains that in terms of a tendency to regard our inclinations, our appetites, and even our conventions as though they were some kind of moral absolutes. That's an important contribution. It has to do, if you think about the existentialist idea of man replacing God, Nietzsche's idea of the godlike capabilities of human beings legislating for themselves, the fact that I chose it makes it right. That kind of notion of human beings as arbiter is, I think, reading this text in Maimonidean eyeglasses, I think it's the kind of thing that was intended when the serpent spoke with forked tongue, as serpents do, promising Adam and Eve that they would be gods. They thought that meant that they would, that their judgments would be incorrigible. What it really meant was that they would be making judgments for themselves, and they would not be like gods at all, because their judgments would not necessarily be infallible at all. Think about Genesis. Think about the idea, the first value judgment that occurs in the Torah, which has already been mentioned in this conference, when God creates the first created thing, which is light, and pronounces it good. God sees that it's good. I like to point out to people that the first value judgment in the Torah is in fact an aesthetic value judgment that helps us get away from the stereotypic notion that Hebrews are about morals and Greeks are about aesthetics. That's oversimplified, of course. The light is good before it has any function, before it has any utility, before it even has an emblematic status. It's good in itself, but that's a good Kantian definition of an aesthetic judgment. It's good for its own sake, not for the uses it will later be put to. Also good is the natural order, announced in the division of light from darkness and land from water. The fecundity of the earth and the seed-bearing plants that are able to reproduce themselves, yielding flowers and fruit and perpetuate their kind. The earth teeming with diversity, and the creatures regarded as good in themselves and for their own sake, and their fecundity is regarded as a good, is presented as a good in Genesis. It's against that background that we have to think about evils, and I'm going to stress, and I'll come back to this point, my own philosophical take on the problem of evil. My philosophical take is this: that evils are to be weighed against the goods they presuppose. That is to say, if one wants to state the problem of evil and wonder why is there suffering, why do righteous people suffer and so forth, why are there both natural and moral evils, one has to recognize that what makes an evil evil is that there is a good presupposed upon which that evil is parasitic, against which that evil attacks, the concept of evil is parasitic upon the concept of good in the same way that evils themselves are parasitic upon goods. The book of Job is rabbinically, fancifully attributed to Moses. And the reason is suggested by a passage that Rabbi Feldman alluded to earlier today, that there was one thing that Moses didn't understand, and that is why good people suffer. That was felt to be a lacuna in the very comprehensive moral and legal and spiritual legislation of the Mosaic Torah. And the idea was that the rabbis put it by saying that Moses wrote the book of Job as well to cover the other side of the story. So they don't mean that necessarily to be taken literally, but they think that the book of Job balances the promises and rewards and punishments that are promised in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, where people are told that if they keep God's laws, they'll be rewarded, and if they violate God's laws, they'll be punished. And it isn't necessarily the way things always work out. The natural move for many religious people has been to try and compensate for that problem of the good not always seeming to get the best end of things, and the bad people always getting the longer end of the stick, or not always, but often enough that it's troubling. A lot of people have proposed an afterlife as a way of evening up the balance in that regard. As was mentioned earlier today, that was not a notion which was in the 5 books of Moses. It's not a notion which occurs really anywhere in the canonical Hebrew Bible. And I think, I can tell you parenthetically why I think that is. It's partly as a reaction against Egyptian culture, which puts such great emphasis on the afterlife, and therefore a great emphasis on death and what follows after it. I think the Mosaic Torah is very actively opposed to that way of looking at things. That's why you have laws regulating every aspect of life, but almost nothing about death in the entire Mosaic Torah. The biblical outlook, which is pursued by the rabbis, and they do eventually introduce the idea of an afterlife, adapting it from other sources, is that they would not agree with Plato that the body is a sepulcher or a tomb. They think that our task is to make this life holy, and that means that their naturalistic ethics is aspirational. They want to take what we've got and make more of it. There's a directionality towards transcendence. I want to say a little bit about the sages, as they're traditionally called. The sages in Jewish parlance refers to what they call Chazal. That means Chachamim Zichronam Livracha. The sages of blessed memory. This is the rabbis of the Talmud, the rabbis of the Mishnah. They're called Chazal collectively. The sages bring the changes on the possible responses to the problem of evil, represented for them by the suffering of innocents and seeming thriving of the wicked. The first obvious effort would be to say that when innocent people suffer, they may not be as innocent as they appear to be. Maybe there's some hidden flaw, some hidden sin, maybe some ritual violation, maybe some moral fault, that the ills that such people suffer are not real ills, is a second move of a similar nature, redefining good and evil to accommodate the anomaly, the moral anomaly of God permitting good people to suffer, bad people to prosper. related would be a third type of answer, which you certainly find in the Talmud, that there is compensation in the hereafter, and that the sufferings in this world will be eclipsed by the joys of the hereafter. A fourth move, which is also found in the Talmud, it's very voluminous, so it's got all the options covered, I think, is that sufferings that we undergo are warnings or chastisements. They're God looking out for us by causing us pain, which is supposed to lead us to examine our ways and test ourselves and think maybe I did something wrong, and that will keep us on the qui vive. It was mentioned earlier that self-examination is an important principle, certainly in Sufism, certainly in pietism in general, very much in the biblical and rabbinic tradition. And that self-examination is supposed to be prompted by look at yourself, see if you did something wrong. If you can't find anything that you did wrong, maybe it's a caution that you're undergoing. And I mentioned earlier, I'll mention it now, the 23rd Psalm anticipates that idea when it has the poet picturing himself as a sheep being taken care of by the shepherd, which is God, and he says, "Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." So if the shepherd, and you may have seen this, if you've ever watched the shepherd gives the sheep a whack to keep him on the right path, that sheep knows that the shepherd is looking after him, and he's actually not annoyed at being hit. He's kind of pleased because the sheep, the poet as sheep, is appreciative of the fact that God cares about him. Another move is that, and this comes a lot from the Stoics, that sufferings of innocent people are meant to test them or to display their moral prowess. I mentioned the passage earlier today in which Seneca says, if you're suffering, you should be grateful to the ruler of the universe, because it's like a soldier who's been given a tough assignment. Instead of griping and complaining, he says, the commander must merely think well of me because he's assigned me this difficult task. You should feel honored. The rabbis have a similar doctrine, and it's partly motivated by the sufferings of Israel collectively, so that here the suffering servant is Israel, as the original context in Isaiah suggests, and the notion is, as they put it in one image, that in making linen, we beat only the best of the flax stalks. You know, the crummy ones you throw away, but the really good ones, you beat them, because you have to break that cellulose barrier in order to get the good fiber out of it. I can give you the sources for all of these, those who are interested. Another approach to dealing with both moral and natural evil is to contrast special with general providence. That's again a Stoic move widely used by the rabbis. The Stoics say that the gods attend to great matters. They're not really concerned with the little stuff. That's reflected in a line in Maimonides. He doesn't adopt this view, but he mentions it. He says, you know, maybe God is too exalted to be concerned with little things the way a householder might not be so interested in the comings and goings of his house cats. It's beneath God's notice. As I stressed that Maimonides did not endorse that view, but he quotes it as one of the options. And you do find, and you find it in Plutarch rejecting the Stoic view. The gods attend to great matters, and there's a more welcome version of that. You can see it in the book of Job, where there's reference to the fact that the rain falls on the sea. If the rain just existed to water your crops, it wouldn't be needed on the sea. Obviously, God has a larger plan, and the rain is part of that larger plan. It's not there just for our benefit. And there may be things in nature, we think of earthquakes or tsunamis and things like that. There may be things in nature which are necessary for the general operation of nature, even though they might harm individuals. One could also take the approach of following Plato and Aristotle in calling good and noble deeds worthy, choice-worthy in themselves. That leads to, again, a Stoic approach to the problem of evil. The Stoics are very interested in what we're not able to control. Out of this comes the idea that the morally right action is choice-worthy in itself, that virtue, as the Stoics like to put it, that virtue is its own reward. So don't go looking extrinsically for how are the righteous rewarded and why are the wicked prospering. The fact that the righteous are able to be righteous is intrinsically worthwhile. They've got their reward in the life that they live. Thus, we have the 2nd century, before the Common Era, 2nd century Jewish sage Antigonus of Soko says in the Mishnah that we should not be like servants who serve for the sake of a reward, but like those who serve without expecting any reward. He doesn't say that there will be no reward, but that's not the point of what of our service to God. The point of our service is to do the right thing because it's the right thing, and that's doing it the right way. Antigonus saw greater freedom and nobility in acts chosen for their own sake rather than meretriciously. And he capped his line by saying, "And let the fear of heaven be upon you." Fear of heaven in this context means piety. It does not mean being afraid of punishment or worried that you're going to miss out on your reward. On the contrary, it means do the pious thing because it's the right thing to do. That is doing an action because it's the right thing to do. As any deontologist would tell you, you don't need a reward beyond that. I'll move on to the first Jewish philosopher that we know in any detail. This is Philo of Alexandria, sometimes called Philo Judaeus. Great philosopher, wrote extensively in the form of commentaries on scripture and wrote thematic books as well. He was the first philosopher to set the achievements of Greek philosophy alongside the wisdom of scripture, and as Harry Wolfson has shown, his work was foundational to what would become the great tradition of medieval philosophy down to modern times, and in some ways down to the present. He neglects none of the standard responses to the problem of evil. One, which we know from Plato, is to turn over the creation of the world to a lesser God. You know, there's a movie a few years ago called Children of a Lesser God. Why did God mess up a little bit in creating this world? Philo is very interested in the fact that we humans have free will, and he doesn't want to muddy God's hands with making God responsible for the fact that we have the freedom to make bad choices. And so, although he doesn't introduce a lesser God as a craftsman, and everybody knows that craftsmen make mistakes, and you have the rule of 2.5, it, you know, takes twice as long, costs twice as much, and comes out half as good as you paid for if you have somebody do work in your house. Philo doesn't go quite that way, but Philo, as you know, relies upon the ideas as the plan for the making of the universe. And as Wolfson pointed out, The ideas in the case of Philo's story about creation become active participants along with God. This is pinned upon the verse, let us create man in our own image, where God is speaking in the plural, and the rabbis all want to know who's he talking to. The answer that Maimonides likes is that God is talking to his familia, which means his retinue, his servants, which Maimonides says refers to the ideas. He likes the fact that it says that God consulted. The rabbis say that God consulted with the angels, and he likes the word consulted because that's the same image that's used by Plato when he's talking about God relating to the ideas. But the ideas are a step down from God himself in Philo, and as I said, Wolfson points out that God is consulting these ideas and making them almost active partners. We're not going to personify angels here, but they're working like angels alongside of God. And that would explain some of the declension from the perfection. They become, as it were, co-workers with God, and God needing handled that muddled mass which anchors our lower nature, otherwise known as our bodies. Like the rabbis, Philo allows that those who suffer may not be as innocent as they seem. God knows what we know not. His standard is more exacting than ours, he puts it. And like many a philosopher, he contests the adequacy of the very natural but still Epicurean notion that the good can be equated with pleasure and that the evil can be equated with pain. They're using the wrong coin to judge the goods and evils that God distributes. It's not all a matter of pleasure and pain. Philo presses the promise that keeping God's laws will liberate Israel from disease. Textually, in the Torah, that promise is more limited. It says that God promises to free the liberated Israelites, if they follow his law, from the diseases of Egypt. And it's natural to interpret that passage in terms of following God's laws, meaning if you keep clean and you avoid promiscuity and you circumcise your sons and you do these other laws, you will avoid some of the diseases that you suffered when you were slaves in Egypt. Philo actually takes it in a somewhat more general way, which is going to go beyond the naturalism that you might like to find in Philo. And he says, well, it could happen that you'll be suffering from disease without having violated those laws. And he says when that happens, it's to remind us of our mortality. So he takes that idea of chastisement and warning, and he puts it in a broader framework, because remembering your mortality, which is going to be a big theme in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is a way of bettering oneself morally. He relies, of course, on the idea of the precedence of the general over the particular providence to explain why some people suffer without deserving. God cares for all humanity and indeed for the world at large. So God is still the creator of the natural order, and the uniform laws of nature are going to operate even if they may be harmful to some individuals. He also relies in the spirit of Antigonus of Socho on the Stoic teaching that virtue is its own reward. As he puts it, prudence is the reward of prudence, justice and every other virtue are the rewards of justice. And you have that concept around the same time in the Mishnah, where each divinely ordained duty draws another in its train. The line in the Mishnah is mitzvah goreret mitzvah. Each commandment fulfilled The reward of it is you get to do another commandment. It's like those ice cream places where they used to you eat the big thing and then you get another big thing to follow it up. But the big thing here is the opportunity and the inclination to fulfill another commandment. Vice, in the same way, engenders vice, as Philo argues. And both vice and virtue are sown into the social ethos as well as one's personal character, as habits become ingrained in one's identity or customary community. So it's not just thicker and stronger in oneself, but it's, as they say, courtesy is contagious. Where it's customary, it becomes more widespread. Philo pursues the dynamic of virtues rather than isolated actions. That's a theme we've been touching on again and again in this conference already. He thus explains and broadens God's injunction with regard to the manna. The passage about the manna in the Bible is, the people shall go out and gather a day's portion for a day, that I may prove them whether they will walk in my law or no. So God calls the manna a test. Philo generalizes on that idea. Here's what he says. The man of worth sets himself to acquire day for the sake of day, light for the sake of light, the beautiful for the sake of the beautiful alone, not for the sake of something else. This is the divine law, to value virtue for its own sake. So he takes this seemingly narrow-focused passage on the manna as a test, and he broadens it to the whole appreciating goods for their own sake, and thus appreciating virtue for its own sake, coming back to that large theme. And that theme is a response to the problem of evil, because then you're not looking for some extraneous, extrinsic reward or the avoidance of punishment. You've already got your reward when you've done the right thing. Philo does not so much resolve as diffuse the Epicurean dilemma. Like the sages and like the Torah itself, he sees piety in its truest form not as fear of God or even hope of reward, but gratitude. We appreciate God's grace when we practice the virtues in love. We love God and give Him glory when we prize and practice the virtues for their own sake. So if you want to be a pious person, the way to do it is to do the right thing because it's the right thing. That's how your actions praise God. That's a big rabbinic theme as well, and they make the point that someone who is a scholar and acts ignominiously is defaming God, is blaspheming, as they put it, because people will look at him and say, oh look, he has studied these texts and look how he behaves, and that discredits not only the study of the text, but discredit God, who is the theme of those texts. And similarly, if one lives a virtuous life, one's actions testify, resonates with what Dr. Crow was saying, one's actions testify to the beliefs that one holds and lives by. Philo praises Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, for boldly confronting vulgar equations of wealth and happiness, or poverty, of wealth with happiness, or poverty with misery, and then broadening that case to include his Jewish compatriots in Alexandria, who are all of them exiles from the Holy Land. He argues that exile, or even slavery, does not make one unfree. A fool living in a palace can be a slave. A virtuous person living in exile or even in slavery can be free. Turn now to Saadia Gaon. How are we doing for time? We're going to talk about Saadia, we're going to talk about Maimonides.
You have 7 minutes.
7 minutes. Okay, I'm going to run through Saadia very quickly. Saadia is in the 9th, 10th century. He dies in 942. He writes an elaborate commentary on the Book of Job, which I have translated, as Dr. Palmer pointed out. There are rabbis who want to read the Book of Job as, some of them make a point of saying that it's a fiction. It probably is a fiction, but it's a fiction that contains a larger truth, which is that righteous people do suffer, And if saying it's a fiction is meant to imply that that doesn't happen, that's a pretty pathetic attempt to dismiss the problem of evil. Saadia believes that life itself is a trial. He believes that the friends of Job who come to comfort him are doing an exercise in bad faith because they think that Job wouldn't have suffered unless he was being punished. He must have some hidden sin. He's being arrogant to deny it. God, at the end, as you know, vindicates Job, blames his companions. Saadia offers two answers to the question of the book of Job. First one comes from Elihu at the end of the book, the young man who intervenes after the three friends have been refuted by Job as he sees it. Elihu offers the idea of recompense, that God will make it up to Job, that the hereafter will be so glorious that, that Job's suffering will be eclipsed by that recompense. This is founded on the doctrine of the sufferings of love, that God chooses certain people to subject them to sufferings in order to justify giving them a greater reward than they would otherwise have gotten. Saadia, since that's a rabbinic doctrine, Saadia embraces it. Maimonides, in spite of the fact that it's a rabbinic doctrine, rejects it rather angrily. He says it's unbiblical and it's untrue and it makes a mockery of God's justice. That's not the right way to reward the righteous. Saadia says an interesting thing about the sufferings of love. He says, well, somebody might object that if God wanted to single out those people for special benefits, why didn't he just do so? Why did he make them go through all this in order to do it? And Saadia makes the point that rewards have to be earned, and that part of earning them is doubt. You don't know what the outcome is going to be. He's bucking a lot of traditional commentary, including Islamic commentary on this story. Doubt is part of the human condition, and that involves the authenticity of the human condition. He says if Job had known in advance that he was going to be rewarded, that would turn the whole story into a bad joke. The word he uses in Arabic is abath. The answer of Elihu, however, is bracketed in a way by Saadia because he thinks that there's a higher answer in God's speech from the storm wind. And the basis of that higher answer, and you could read this at great length in my translation of Saadia's commentary on the book of Job, the basis of that higher answer is that God has a much larger concern. It's an appeal to the idea of general providence. So Job was innocent. He didn't deserve to suffer. That can happen. Saadia bucks the rabbis on that one. They say, oh, it says in the text that Job didn't sin with his lips. Yes, but he sinned in his heart. They jump on that. No, he says Job was innocent, didn't deserve to suffer, but that notion that he was being held for a greater reward is a human answer, as I put it. The divine answer has to do with God looks after the whole of nature, and all of the natural examples that are given in God's climactic speech from the storm wind at the end of the book of Job, several chapters long, involves God looking after all kinds of creatures and not just individual human beings. Maimonides rejects the idea of the suffering of love, as I've told you. He does like the appeal to general providence, and he has a further two ways of addressing the problem of evil. One is to say that although innocent people do suffer, on the whole, the goods in this life outweigh the evils. Otherwise, we can't really appreciate creation as a divine act of grace. That's an implied criticism of Saadia, who says that creation is an act of grace and then thinks that evils outweigh goods in this life, and therefore we need another life to make up for it. Maimonides thinks that there will be another life, but he doesn't think we need another life to make up for it. He rejects that idea. He criticizes the Neoplatonic philosophers, and he calls them the philosophers with a capital P in my translation, so you'll know it's a school he's talking about, not people who do philosophy generically. He criticizes them for not taking advantage enough of their doctrine of matter. They could have understood that the Satan in the book of Job is a personification of matter, which is the source of our weaknesses, both our vulnerability physically to the violence of nature and of our moral vulnerability as well, our appetites which get carried away with themselves and so forth. He notes that in the book of Job it says that the Satan came along with the sons of God. He was not one of the sons of God. That means he was not a principle. He was not a Platonic idea. He was not an angel. He was not a divine-like being or a fallen angel. Saadia had already rejected the notion that there could be a fallen angel. Came along with them means it's a concomitant. And the basic idea which Maimonides draws from the Neoplatonic philosophers, but takes them to task for not exploiting sufficiently, the basic idea is that if God is going to create, there's got to be otherness. There's this infinite being. He's not going to create another infinite being. That's not logically possible. He's going to create lesser beings. These lesser beings will be other than God. That otherness is what the Satan personifies. Its name is matter, and it is both the basis of suffering, the basis of wrong moral choices, and the basis of the possibility of our rising and returning intellectually to God, because that body that we have is the embodiment we have, the vehicle, as it was put earlier today, by which we reach out toward God. One more point that Maimonides picks up from Aristotle and uses in a very subtle way in the Guide to the Perplexed is that there is a general balance in nature, that one element, there are four elements, fire, water, earth, and air, and one element overwhelms another, but there's a cyclicity to that. It's through that cyclicity that the stability of the cosmos is maintained, and by God's grace, nature is allowed to persist. That is, he doesn't think that nature will be destroyed in a cataclysm. He actually uses Quranic language to describe that cataclysm and says this is he finds comparable events in the prophets. He says they're talking about political upheaval and warfare. They're not talking about a supernatural cataclysm, an apocalypse. He rejects that idea. What's actually happening in nature is that there is a general providence in which there's a cyclicity in nature, just like the water cycle, so the elements cycle with one another. That creates stability, which is the basis of divine justice at the level of general providence. And sometimes we get caught in that. Sometimes the tsunami will strike, or the landslide will occur, or the forest fire will occur. That doesn't eliminate the goodness of the act of creation. I think that's about time. Yeah? No? About one moment, what?
One more minute.
One more minute, I'll say one more thing. The one more thing is this. Maimonides quotes a rabbinic doctrine that he says that all God's acts are just, and the rabbinic doctrine is that even if you get a thorn in your finger and pull it right out, that was a punishment. And the least pleasure that you enjoyed was a reward. He noticed, although he doesn't think that pains and pleasures are the coin of the realm as far as God is concerned, he thinks that they're real and that suffering is a real. Remember, he's a practicing physician. He wrote 10 great books on medicine. Suffering is not something we're meant to undergo. It's a concomitant of our embodiment. He quotes Galen on that. But he's got an interesting way of understanding this rabbinic doctrine that the least pain you suffer, even the thorn in your finger, was a punishment, and the least pleasure you suffer or undergo was a reward. And I take my text to establish what he must have meant by that from Anaximander, who talks about the balance of nature being maintained by let's see if I have that text. I'm not going to try and find it because I'll use up my minute, but the idea that Anaximander had is that our very presence here on earth does involve a kind of aggression against the environment. Not that we dislike the environment, but we're here, we breathe the air, we take part, we have a metabolism, we eat food, we do all these things, and there are consequences to that. And in the course of time, everything in nature pays the price that it must pay for that presence, for that taking up of space, for that exercise of energy, for that use of and abuse of resources. And that is, from a personal point of view, from a subjective standpoint, that is a punishment for our aggression. But from a broader and more universal point of view, it is part of the balance of nature. It is part of general providence by which nature is sustained through God's grace. I'll stop there.
Thank you.